Welcome back to Que Pasa Nashville. My name is Christina Allen, and my guest is John Hiskey, who's the Associated Chair, Professor, and Director of Graduate Studies at Vanderbilt in the Department of Political Science. We're having a fascinating conversation about immigration as it relates to the migration of the number of Mexicans returning back to the United States, to Mexico, as well as the number of Central Americans coming through Mexico and just turning themselves at the border. So we were saying that our Central Americans, families, children are just walking to Border Patrol in Mexico from Honduras, El Salvador because of the crime and saying, I'm turning myself in. And that will happen regardless of if there's a wall that's being suggested, because Mexicans is at the lowest point ever, from 1.6 million in 2000
to 190,000
of Mexicans, but these are Central Americans. What does that number look like?
So the number of Central Americans apprehended at the border, at the U.S. border in 2015, I believe, was 218,000. So it exceeded the number of Mexicans being apprehended at the border.
But they're not sneaking in, they're just saying, hey, asylum. Define asylum then. What is our U.S. policy according to that, as well as on our immigration court, and what does that mean?
Yes, so the asylum issue is a difficult one, and I don't believe we have time to go into the details of that. What we, I think, do have time for is the disparity in funding on the U.S. side in terms of the policy response to Central Americans arriving. And so the response can be either to enforce the border or spend money on the immigration court system. And just to give you an idea of where we are now, the Custom and Border Protection Agency and ICE, their total budget in 2014 was $18 billion.
$18 billion for U.S. Border Patrol?
Yes.
Okay, ICE, okay.
And the agency, the budget for the agency in charge of the immigration court system, its budget was around $250 million.
Huge disparity.
Huge disparity.
So we have all these people trying to keep them out, but they're not really coming in.
Right.
But the courts, what does that mean with the courts?
So what happens when someone initiates an asylum claim process is, if they are determined to have a credible fear, they go through, first they go through a credible fear interview.
Okay.
And if they pass that stage, then they are told, essentially, you wait for your immigration court date, and you appear before an immigration judge, and you make your case for asylum. Okay. And so, to give you an idea of the challenge the U.S. immigration court system faces, the average wait time to go before a judge once somebody passes their credible fear interview in the early 2000s was 350 days.
Okay.
In 2012, I believe, the average wait time was 670 days.
So if I seek asylum from Central America, I have to wait over 2 years to be able to get a court appearance, even though I've been told that I had reason to do it.
Yes.
Why don't we send them back?
U.S. law and obligations to international and domestic law require that they have due process.
Okay, repeat that, please.
U.S. and international law both require that we provide due process to anyone judged to have a credible fear of returning to their home country.
And that is just who we are as the United States.
Yes.
Okay, so
and essentially, if we were to return many of these people without due process, we would be returning them to
the fear,
their deaths.
So so the immigration court is a challenge.
Yes.
So we're not funding enough judges to hear this thing.
And lawyers, and the entire system has been underfunded for 20 years, while at the same time we've ramped up funding for border enforcement.
So do you think, and not to get political, but the concept that most people think is if you build the wall, they won't come.
Right.
And what you're saying is the ones that are coming have a right to go to the border and for asylum seekers.
Yes.
And therefore the proportion of funding might be looked at in the wrong spots.
That would be my recommendation, if you will.
So does anyone listen?
Well, in the current context, I don't believe there's much attention being paid to the immigration court system.
Las Cruces, New Mexico, my hometown, the Rio Grande literally is in my backyard. I have to cross it to get to my sister's. We had a lot of Mexicans, most of them, that crossed the border undocumented. They would come right after Easter, around March or so, and work till November. They worked the fields, the onion fields, the chili. We have the largest pecan orchard. They would leave in November and then come back in March. They didn't want to stay here. What about migrant worker visas? Is that increased in numbers, do you know?
No.
So, I mean, they would rather come and go, but we're not talking asylum. I'm just talking Mexicans here.
I mean, that's clearly the other area of our immigration law that we need to fix. It seems fairly clear that there's a need for migrant workers, and we are not providing any channel for them to do it legally.
And if we probably did, I know a lot of the farmers would do it as legal as possible because they depend on them.
Dairy farms in upper state New York, the agricultural fields in the Southwest, and everywhere in between, they would absolutely love to have a immigration system that worked for them and provided guest worker or some type of visa program, and it's simply not something that has been talked about. It's all been about border enforcement.
And I think if that's the sexy way of saying, okay, controlling our borders is to build a wall. Being from New Mexico, and again, the Rio Grande Valley, the Rio Grande is the border between Texas and Mexico, as well as a little bit in New Mexico. But I always say, so if you build the wall, where do our cattle drink the water? Because there's no rain. And so do you put it on our side of the wall, then they can't get to the water, but Mexico's not going to let it put on your side. So I try to understand that aspect of it. But as we're winding up this interview, I mean, what are some key points that or trends that we still have to continue to look at?
Well, I think one of the less mentioned patterns in U.S. migration recently has been the number of people overstaying their visas. So they're coming in on planes, and
I keep thinking they come to go to Disney World and just don't leave.
Right, exactly. So I think that's one area. The other area is getting ready or ramping up, as I said before, the way that we are going to deal with Central American asylum seekers, because
and a lot of these are children.
Yes, absolutely.
And because they're underage, our court system, obligation to them. So as we continue to go with this administration and whatever the results are, with Mexico being more of a vibrant country and less people coming in, I mean, we do have a lot of trade going back and forth. We might build a Nissan here in Saturn, but send parts to the Nissan plant in Mexico, and they might send it back. So there's a lot of trade going back and forth. How is that? I mean, it doesn't really affect our, I mean, you said the foreign direct investment into Mexico is because there's more work for them. Was that going to continue versus coming here, you think?
Well, I think one of the most effective ways to combat, if you will, immigration from countries like Mexico is to have Mexico's economy be prosperous.
Which it is.
And it is. It certainly has some issues that it has to deal with, but by and large, they've been doing fairly well over the past several years. And if we want to control immigration flows from Mexico and Central America, I think investment in those countries and helping bolster their economies makes everyone better off.
As well as trying to help the Central Americans.
Exactly, yes.
Well, I find it, again, as we educate more and more people about the reality and in the facts, I think it brings aha moments, as it did for me, who I'm pretty much aware of all the immigration with this show and so forth, but it was not really realizing the Central Americans. And do we find a lot of apprehension from other countries coming through Mexico?
Well, there certainly are reports recently that
like terrorists?
I don't know about terrorists, but there are reports of people fleeing violence in Africa and other parts of the world entering into South America that have lenient visa requirements and then making the trek across into Mexico. So that's something we have to watch out for.
Thank you so much, John, for joining us, and join us all the time each week with Que Pasa Nashville. Thank you very much. Gracias.